I'm Irene.
I'm Erica.
I'm Christina.
And I'm Carolyn, and today we'll be discussing Minari, which won Best Foreign Film at the Golden Globes this year. Minari is a movie about the Asian immigrant experience, and it follows a Korean family that moved to Arkansas in around the late 80s, and they bought a farm, and it follows their relationships and different struggles throughout this experience. And so the starting question we have, since we just watched it last night and it's very fresh on our minds, is what are you guys' initial impressions after finishing the movie? So first reactions.
I can go. I think for me, my immediate reaction was I cannot relate to it as much as I thought I could before going into it. And I think it does, because I knew it was about a Korean family that immigrates to America, and I was like, that's me. But I think it also showed a very specific type of immigrant story, especially because it was a different time period, like in the 80s. So I think that also made it seem a bit less relatable for me, but it was still relatable in the sense of like, I think I understand a lot of the cultural aspects of it, and I think the general Asian immigrant story aspect of it was something that, I don't know, I feel like you don't see as much in mainstream media, and so I thought it was interesting to like watch it in that aspect. So
Yeah, I think similarly, I went into the movie thinking, oh, maybe I could connect to this. I hadn't read anything or even watched the trailer beforehand, so I didn't really know anything about it, except it was in Korean. And I was actually very impressed. I could understand all the Korean without subtitles, so Korean class must be working, y'all.
I was proud of you.
But I also didn't vibe with this. No, I didn't vibe. I didn't resonate with the story because I personally have not immigrated to America. But so I think what interested me more was the family dynamics, and especially with the grandma coming in and how the kids related with the grandma, and then how the kids related with their parents as well. I thought that spoke well of Korean culture. You saw a lot of how the parents were trying to get their kids to respect the grandmother, and respect for elders in Korea is like a very big topic. So I think in that sense, I was like, oh, it was a very well done movie. It was very cinematic. The nature was very beautiful. And I thought, what's her name? Hanyeri was gorgeous throughout it all. So yeah, there's that.
I think for me, I felt really anxious for an hour and a half into the movie, and it's like a 2-hour movie, so that's a really big
Everything
chunk of
except
the
the last 20 minutes.
Yeah. So I think the entire time we were like waiting for something bad to happen, and there was also just a lot of tension between the parents. So yeah, I think I resonated with the household dynamic a lot, and the dynamic of like we will do everything and anything and like suffer through anything to provide for the family. Like that mentality, I think I resonated, or I didn't resonate with, but I think my parents resonated with that mentality. Yeah, I think those were my initial thoughts.
Yeah, I think we had a slight split where Christina and I were pretty stressed through the movie, and then Irene and Erica were just chilling.
okay,
yes.
we enjoyed it.
we
understand where.
But I think for me, it was very anxiety-inducing, and I think we talked about this a bit last night, but I think the film did a good job of capturing the idea of tensions that are kind of unspoken and underlying the whole movie that build and build and build, but it never like you're just waiting for it to climax or kind of like erupt in some sense, and the stress of like waiting through that build-up. And so I guess I understand why the movie portrayed the tension in the way that it did. For me personally, it's kind of the opposite of my personality, and I hate it, and I would have preferred things to be resolved earlier. But I definitely think that when it did hit the climax, this is a spoiler alert, but this whole review would be a spoiler. So when the warehouse catches on fire, I did think that did a really good job of capturing where the loyalty of the father was not like lied, And also, it was still a climax and resolution that didn't involve talking out their feelings and problems. It was almost like a non-verbal resolution, and it was done through seeing the father again spend time with his son, which he had stopped doing throughout the movie, and I thought that was an interesting way to go about portraying conflict and resolution.
Yeah, no, I think like the main reason why I felt tense the entire time was because even the conflict was also unspoken, like between the parents, and the entire time I was just thinking like this mom just needs to say something and just talk out like why she's so frustrated at the dad. Like clearly she thinks he's staying at the farm for selfish reasons. Although to me, I think I never doubted that, because towards the end you find out that he was doing it for the family all along to provide for them. And I think to me, I never doubted that he was doing it for the family. So to me, I was just frustrated that the mom wouldn't say anything, and that brought back memories of like my childhood and my parents like being like, oh yeah, Christina, just go to bed, it's fine. And then they'll like start fighting in the bathroom as if I can't hear it, but our walls are really thin at home. So I remember that, and like when the parents threw like the paper planes at the parents with notes on it saying like, please don't fight, like
When the kids threw them.
yeah, the kids threw it at the parents when they were fighting. And it's like, yeah, I do remember not the kids like mediated the fight, but I remember mediating as a kid and like feeling that tension, and also just feeling really helpless in like family finances, and knowing that was like the root cause of a lot of their fights. So yeah, those were the memories that.
Yeah, for sure. And it also made me think about how that tension of when you have nothing to fall back on, so unlike families that may have more generational wealth or have more support because they've been in America longer, when the immigrant family, either it's you giving up your own personal dreams or even like successes in order for the success of the family. Because I think the only thing my parents ever thought about was when my mom wanted to go back to work. And that was the only thing like they disagreed on, because my mom wanted some kind of like job or role or part of her life that was outside of just like the family. But that also put a lot of strain on like my dad being able to take care of us, and so I just remember that also being like a pretty major point of fighting. So it was cool to see that portrayed.
I think it was interesting that, cause okay, so going back to like how you guys felt it was like very anxiety inducing during the entire movie. I was also thinking about this like after the movie, because like I was like, oh, is it because me and Erica are Korean? Like, was there something to do with that? I don't think it was necessarily that. I think, but you can also add on to it too. But for me, I don't know if it's like a Korean thing, but it definitely showed in the movie that at least in this Korean family, like you like showing like that you care and that you like care about like this family, like I feel like is expected to not be said. And so I just thought of it as like, oh, I know where the dad is coming from, and I'm sure the mom does too, but being in a circumstance where they are literally the only people that can like support one another in a like, because they were the only Korean family like in that community, and then everyone else was like just like very like white southern like Christian evangelical people. And so like just knowing that there was that added pressure on the mom to also like worry about the kids and like worry about the family, and then the dad is also worrying about the family, but in his own like way of by like providing for them. I think that's usually the focus or the expectation of like the father in at least like a Korean household. And so I felt like they were saying just enough, because that's kind of how even my family like kind of goes about a lot of situations with financial and like job stability. It's kind of like, we know that my dad is doing all this, like he spends less time with us because he is providing for our family, and that's not something that we like have ever talked about in person or like with each other, but it's just this like underlying expectation of like, not saying that it's like good, but I'm saying like I think it's kind of that's why I was like, oh, this feels very normal, or it's like very natural for a family to go through this. So
Yeah, I think maybe the reason I didn't feel so much tension was because of that. I mean, I don't recall my parents ever fighting, or maybe I was just a heavy sleeper, so like I didn't wake up or something, but I don't ever recall them fighting over finances or who was spending more time with the children. And so for me, maybe it was just unspoken that this was the way things were, and like we don't question it, or I was too naive to question it. But yeah, I didn't feel tense throughout the movie either, because I was very like, yeah, this seems normal. And of course they're arguing about it because, you know, the father the movie made it very clear that it was the father's dream and not the mother's dream. But I think whenever they fought, you couldn't see their like resolution or their like talking, like the end of the fights, but you could see that things did change. Like the father did give in a little because he brought the grandma over from Korea, and that kind of like in my mind was like, oh yeah, so he does still care for her, whereas like it could just be like another bad attention, but to me I was like, oh, that sounds good. Looks like everyone got what they wanted. But I think for me, one of the bigger tensions was the difference between this Korean family and like the white surrounding neighborhood, because at every turn, whenever they interacted with some white male, I was so suspicious of them. I thought they were all sketchy, and maybe the director just did a really good job of painting all of the white men as a little sketchy. But with Paul, I mean, we never really found out why he was the way he was, and we never really, like, I just thought the banker guy was just gonna like screw them over, but he didn't. It just felt like he was going to. So for me, the racial tension was more prominent.
It's interesting that they had those like instances of racism, like the way the little boy asked like David why his face was so flat, or the women interacted and treated the mother as kind of like this foreign object of like she's so
they
cute.
kept on calling her cute.
Yeah,
That was
which is
really
very like infantilizing.
Yeah.
But like it's interesting how that was never like, it was never shown how it affected them, and it was never really addressed or resolved. But I think that's a pretty normal way of Asian Americans experiencing and processing racism, is that you just kind of brush it off, and then you might not think about it for years and years.
Yeah, that is a good point, because like watching that little girl go to the daughter and be like, stop me when I say a word in your language.
Yeah.
Like I am appalled at that. But clearly the daughter was just like, oh yeah, that one was the word. Good job, you got one. And then moved on. So.
And I think it also says something about, because they had some conversations about, because the mom was, I guess, like, quote unquote religious. Like, she wanted to go to a church, and then that's why they did, like, try out the church in, like, the closest church in their community. But, like, I thought it was interesting, the conversation with, her co-worker, and she was saying, why is there not a Korean church like in this area? And then they're like why would you create a Korean church for like 15 families? Like, and a lot of the people who leave the city are because they don't want to be, like, they're leaving because of the Korean churches there. And I think that does say a lot about, or not a lot, but I think it brings up a good point about, like, my family started going to church not because we were religious, but to have a community. And so I think Korean churches, or any ethnic church in general, is a big part of it is because of the community aspect of it, and wanting to feel like you belong, wanting to feel like you aren't the minority like in the rest of the world and things like that. So I was just like, I think that was somewhat relatable, because I was like, when we saw the scene with them at the white church, you know, you kind of like understand why you would want to be in a community where like you're not the only family that's different and ostracized in a certain way. So yeah.
Yeah, and going off of that with like ethnic churches being like the only community for a certain like minority group, I also think with that, outside of community, it's also like the only way you really survive, because like that's how like if you're in a new country and you don't know the language as well and like something happens with like either hospitals or like food or anything, like you need that community versus like if you can move more freely in a society. And I think that's interesting to see like the role my own home church, which is like an ethnically Chinese church, like all the parents like buy the groceries together and they help like the older grandmas with like either finding a job or like with different forms, and it's just a form of like survival.
Yeah, I think another interesting scene was when the little boy went over to the white kids' home for a sleepover, and you just see the difference in how like the white kid's dad interacted with him versus how the Asian parents like treat David when he's at home. I feel like there was an unspoken like the Asian, like David probably thought the way that the white family did things was weird, and then the white boy probably thought the way that like David interacted or was like on the more quiet, shy side was like weird. But I think that's also a very like common experience for Asians, and like when they interact with like white families and seeing how they do things, it's just like, oh, it's really different. It's just a very unspoken like, wow, it's just very different. But then like I don't think either side tends to see like why their upbringing impacts the way that they interact socially. So I think that was just interesting that in this movie that you see more of like the Asian household dynamic that impacts like why David is on like the more quiet, like submissive, just kind of like following whatever like the white kid was telling him to do kind of dynamic.
Oh, I didn't really notice that. I always thought he was just quiet because of his heart condition. He was always told like he was weak, and so he shouldn't strain himself. He shouldn't overexert himself a lot. But I could also see. I mean, definitely the white family dynamic is like you could barely call it a family. Like it was like I felt so bad for that boy. Like at first I was like, he's so racist, like racist little boy.
Yeah.
But then I felt bad for him because his upbringing is so. Like I don't even think that was his dad. It was like his mom's girl or boyfriend or something. Because he said, didn't he say?
Tell your mom that I was here last night. I thought he was the dad and he was cheating or something.
I thought he was cheating too.
Because I thought he said like, oh, this is my mom's boyfriend's stash, and then like.
Oh, he did say that.
Yeah. So like that's not even his dad. That's like I think the guy that
His mom's seeing it.
his mom is seeing, and then he is cheating on her. So I think like that whole dynamic, I just was like, you're right. Like your upbringing really does, because obviously it looks like he doesn't have any like proper supervision at home.
Yeah.
So like,
and that's also why he felt so free to ask, why is your face so flat? Like
what? Basic human decency needs to be taught. So.
Whereas like the Asian kids, like you saw how the dad disciplined him. He's like, go get a stick. Like, let me beat you with it.
Yeah.
I was like, wow, it's so different.
Yeah. It was interesting seeing the dad's like parenting methods as well. It was definitely like very reminiscent in some way of just like dealing with things with like discipline, and a lot of times like in a physical way.
Yeah, were your parents very like, what is it? Is it authoritarian or
Disciplinary?
Yeah. Just like, did they do
you guys
that?
get
Like, did you
spanked
get
as kids?
physically hit when you were bad? I guess. Because I didn't experience that, but I know it's very common in like Korean culture at least. So.
I was hit before. I'm trying to think. Oh, I was spanked on the butt with chopsticks, with wooden chopsticks. And I still remember because then it left a red mark, and then the day after my mom felt really bad, and then she apologized for it. And then she never did it again. I think she just didn't. I was young. I was maybe in like 4th or 5th grade. Maybe
That's
3rd
old.
grade.
Yeah, I was
That's
gonna say,
old
I
for
feel
discipline.
pretty-
That's pretty old for discipline.
Wait,
We stopped
maybe
getting
I was
spanked
younger.
Around, like 6 or 6.
Because Because by then you're old enough
to-
to kind of.
for them to like tell you and take away things as punishment.
Oh yeah.
I think there's definitely
I
a
don't
gender
remember
breakdown
what age
because
it was.
I remember getting spanked, but it was maybe only once or twice. My brother's gotten a lot, like a lot more, yeah. But it was usually like rulers or something. But like, it really did die off when we got older. But like, I still argued with my parents about this because my psych lab sophomore year did research on how spanking only ever makes child behavior worse. Like, it has no like real effect on discipline. But I think traditionally there's still a perspective of like, oh, we've always spanked, like it works.
Because I always thought it was because we only had girls, so that's why we never got spanked. But
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I've never asked my parents why they did it.
Yeah.
Like,
Maybe you
use physical
were just
discipline.
good kids.
I mean, sure, but like I'm sure there were moments where like it was frustrating or like we weren't listening. So I just maybe they never felt the need to, yeah. But I think it was also because like my mom has said this before, but she was like, I would have probably raised you differently if we raised you in Korea. But since we're in America, we kind of raised you a bit different, or I guess like their circumstances, their environment was different. So.
A really weird random detail that I remember from my childhood. I think this is when maybe I got hit on the butt when I was in kindergarten. So I remember this happened around like kindergarten, like first grade. So there were a couple times where I always drank a glass of milk for breakfast before going to school. And there were a couple times when I accidentally knocked over that cup of milk. Man, I got yelled at so badly that the next time I did it after, I just started crying immediately. So that I was like, maybe if I just cry preemptively, my parents won't be as mad and they'll go a little lighter on me. But yeah, no, my parents were definitely really strict on me in terms of discipline.
A lot of times, or as I got older, I felt that discipline was less about what you did wrong and more just how stressed your parents were. And so,
No, I
like,
think my parents really wanted me to grow up to be really responsible and
okay.
yeah.
That makes sense.
And I think part of it is like it's a parent's job to give their child values or like morals or like a sense of what is right and what is wrong. Like especially if like the kids are playing with each other or like with other children, and so I think I'm not like opposed to discipline takes many forms, because I think it's very important for children to learn values in their home. I'll be honest though, in Minari, I think David actually got a lot of his, not that he got values from his grandma, because his grandma obviously came later on in his life, but I think his grandma impacted him a lot. And so in that sense, I think the grandma was a very important figure in the story, especially because they just had fun together. It feels like.
It's like she was the first one to believe that he was strong and not weak.
Yeah.
Because of his condition.
Mm-hmm. And I think instilling children with a sense of fun is important. And I don't think he got that before, probably because his parents thought he was weak and couldn't have fun or something. But yeah, I was very pleased when like the grandma, even after she drank his tea, like she was like laughing about it. She was like, it was great, I had fun, like
It's not a big deal.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it was interesting because you kind of assume, or at least I kind of assumed for her to be like a very typical Korean grandma who would just like really just want to like cook for them all the time, and also just tell them like, oh, you can't do this or you can do that.
It's so
blah, blah,
interesting
blah.
that she couldn't cook.
Yeah.
That seems so
She said she couldn't cook,
different.
she couldn't bake, she couldn't do anything. She just taught him
Cards.
card game
Hot
that
dog.
in Korea is a gambling game. So it's also like different morals kind of thing. And so I think and the actress for that role, like I love her in like every single drama or movie that she's been in. But she, I heard, or in an interview that she was in, she said that the director told her to just portray the grandma however she wants. So this is actually just her own
Oh.
interpretation of what kind of grandma she wanted this character to be. And so she wanted the character to not be a very typical grandma and to be able to like give like David and also what was the girl's name? Anne. And like
Is it Anne, not Anna? Is Anne.
Anne. Yeah, Anne and David, like the grandchildren, like just like like more freedom and also just learning to have fun and like enjoying like the life that they have, like all the time. Like even when Hanyeri, she was like so ashamed of like having her mom come and see how she was living. That part I was like, oh my gosh, like because the grandma responded the way she did, she was like, what, because your house is on wheels? Oh, that's so fun. It's like, it just made me, like, it was a funny scene, but it also made me feel very like, oh my gosh, like that's so like amazing of her to see it in that way. Because I think a lot of times, like before when my family first came to America, like I think my mom was also very ashamed of the way that we were living. I didn't know when we were younger, but like she had said that. And so and then our grandma had to come to like take care of me and my sister because they both had to go to work. And I think she just said like it was very hard for her to have our grandma live with us because she just constantly felt like very ashamed about like not being able to like provide the best like clothes for us or like have like the best meals or like even to have my grandma like have to come to America to like take care of us kind of thing. And so I think that resonated with me a lot because just like I think knowing that you have this sense of like shame and honor in Asian cultures, I think is very like prevalent, and it's hard to let go of that even when you're in like a completely new country because it's hard. Like being an immigrant, I think is definitely difficult when you're trying all these things new for your family. You're obviously not going to be in the place where you probably could have been if you were in Korea. So I just really love the grandma character because I think everything she said just made the whole situation at least better for the family. Yeah.
She kind of subverts the idea that she needs to be treated a certain way or have a certain level of respect, and she adds more like lightheartedness.
Yeah.
And it definitely made me think of like Joylet Club and the Rose and her mom, because Rose's mom was like, I thought I was gonna like teach you to be very strong and know your worth, but instead like you grew up to be just like my mother. And that's I mean like we don't know the backstory of this family's past, but that's what the scene where the mom was definitely saying like, oh yeah, like I'm so sorry like that you have to see the way I live, and the grandma was like, no, this is fine. Like that's what I thought of it, like the generational difference, or like it definitely seemed like the grandma I mean we heard a little bit of her backstory, like her husband died when like the mom was very young, and
She's the only child.
yeah, that's why she's the only child. So I think like the grandma's very strong, especially to have this sense of humor at this age. Like I don't know that many old people, but it's very rare that I find an older person with a huge sense of humor and a lot of grace for younger children.
This might be a quick topic, but I also thought it was interesting how like it seemed like a lot of the family conflict or tension was almost from the kids' point of view, because the parents may fight in front of them, but they never resolved it in front of them. Like sometimes they'd come out the next day and be like, oh, we decided to stay here, or they'd be like, oh, we decided grandma would come, or we decided that like we're gonna leave and go to California and like leave your dad here. But like the kids were never part of that conversation. Like, they never saw their parents make that conversation, and like we on screen also never saw the parents have any like emotionally open or like honest decision-making conversations, which I feel like is fairly common.
And we didn't say this earlier in the podcast, but this is based off of the director's actual life.
Yeah.
So I think like a lot of the things that we didn't see, like the reason why it's in the kid's perspective, I think, is because it is his perspective of like what he saw in his own family. And I'm assuming that David is him, like trying to portray him. And so his relationship with like the grandma and also with his like dad and his mom, like that is probably similar to like what he felt like he experienced in his childhood. And I think they portrayed that really well because like I definitely thought like Jacob, Steven Yeun, his role did seem like the main character, but also David seemed like the main character.
Yeah.
So I think like in the end when you see like David like running for the first time, like
That's when I started crying.
yeah, because of his heart condition, but then we find out like, oh, he is fine, like it's like closing, and so like it's getting better. I thought it was interesting because, you know, he started getting better right after his grandma told him like, I'll make sure that you don't die, like I'll make sure that it kind of seemed like it switched over to her. Because she had immediately got her stroke after she reassured him like everything was gonna be okay. And I think like that was also a very interesting way to like kind of portray that, because I don't know, maybe it was also trying to reflect the whole like sacrifice thing, the older generation sacrificing a lot for the younger generation. And I think like it was just like a really it was like a really powerful scene when you see like the little boy like running for the first time like full force like towards his grandma, so like she would like come back home with them. And I think the symbolism in this movie was like really good, because I think words were not as needed for a lot of the scenes that they were using.
Yeah, there was just more action.
Yeah.
And I think that's also, but to be fair, one of my favorite lines that was in the movie was when the wife was saying like, we told each other when we got married that we would save each other, but now you think that only money can save us. I thought that was put very poignantly, especially because in the warehouse scene they do decide to save each other. I'm glad that happened, but I think because there was less dialogue, like and most of the conversations were between the parents, like those words definitely hit harder.
Even though it was only implied in the movie that like the Minari is like the only thing that was growing that they could sell, I thought that was a nice wrap up to that from the grandma, like really emphasizing the role of Minari. I don't remember the quote. Was it that like it's good for everyone regardless of if they're
whether you're rich or poor, it keeps you healthy.
It's a water celery, by the way. She planted it down by the creek, like away from the other crops.
It's also interesting that right before she had her stroke, her last words when she was holding David in bed was Minari, Minari, like wonderful Minari. Like she was kind of like singing that under her breath before she had the stroke. And it was kind of like her last
Gift.
to the family to help them, to sustain them.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. If you haven't, go and check out the movie Minari. It is a very beautiful piece, and we would highly recommend it. But until then, thanks for listening to Wooly Wooly.
Bye.